On the morning of August 19, 1853, the wagon master looked back exactly once. Martha Caldwell remembered that detail clearly enough to write it down that same evening, her hands still trembling, the ink running thin where her fingers had been wet from the river. He turned in his saddle, she wrote, and I could see him weighing it. Whatever he had decided it before I could call out. And I did not call out. She was 29 years old, alone on the south bank of the Snake River, in what is now southern Idaho, on the 19th of August, 1853. Behind her, the wagon, one ox down and unable to rise, 2,000 pounds of furniture and flour and the pressed wild flowers her mother had tucked inside the family Bible in Ohio before Martha left and never looked back. Beside her, 3 children. James, who was 8 years old and already trying not to cry. Lucy, who was 5 and did not yet understand that crying was something to try not to do. And Thomas, 14 months old, wrapped against her chest in a length of muslin, asleep in the boneless way that small children sleep when the world around them has gone entirely wrong. The wagon train was already moving. Martha had 40 miles of trail left before Fort Boise. After Fort Boise, the Blue Mountains. After the Blue Mountains, the Columbia River. After the Columbia, Oregon City. She had left Independence, Missouri on April 14th. It was now August. She had buried her husband in the rocky ground near Fort Hall, 6 weeks and 400 miles back, where cholera had taken 11 people from their company in 4 days. She had packed the wagon herself the morning after the burial. She had hitched the oxen herself. She had driven out of camp while the ground was still dark with dew because she could not bear to watch another sunrise over that particular piece of earth. She had come this far. Now one of her oxen had gone under in the Snake River crossing, panicked by the current, turned sideways, lost in 12 feet of fast water, and the wagon had lurched and stalled, and the remaining ox had pulled for the south bank instead of the north, and here she was, south bank. Wrong side. The wagon train vanishing into the sage on the other shore. She stood there for a moment that she later described in her diary as the longest of my life, and I have had long moments. Then she took Thomas from her chest, handed him to James with specific instructions about keeping him away from the riverbank, and walked to the surviving ox to assess what remained of her situation. This is the kind of woman Martha Caldwell was. She did not sit down and weep until much later. And when she did, she wept quietly, so the children would not hear. What she did not know, in those first terrible minutes on the south bank of the Snake River, was that a man named Elias Horn had already crossed to the north bank with the rest of the company, and then stopped his horse and turned around. He had been watching her from the moment the ox went under. Elias was 36 years old, traveling alone, which was unusual enough that people in the company had noticed and formed opinions. He had a wagon and a team of 4 good mules and no visible reason for going to Oregon except that he had no visible reason for staying anywhere else. He did not talk much. He was known to be competent with animals, careful with fire, and unwilling to discuss his past, the kind of combination that could mean almost anything on the Oregon Trail. He had crossed the Snake at 3 Island Crossing before, in 1849, going to California with everyone else who thought gold was the answer to whatever question their lives were asking. He had come back with enough money to buy land and 4 good mules and no particular desire to settle in California. He understood this river. He knew what the current could take. He had watched the ox go under. He had watched the wagon lurch. He had watched Martha take Thomas from her chest and hand him to the boy with the particular economy of gesture that belongs to women who are doing the next necessary thing because there is nothing else to do. He had crossed with the company, reached the north bank, listened to the wagon master say it was a tragedy but they couldn't stop, and then he sat on his horse for 1 full minute while he made a decision that would change the rest of his life. He turned his mules around and went back into the river. Martha heard the water before she saw him. She straightened from the ox, shading her eyes against the low August sun, and watched a man on a horse leading 3 mules come out of the Snake River onto her bank like something she had imagined. She said, "What are you doing?" He said, "Bringing the mules." She said, "I can see you're bringing the mules. Why?" He looked at the stranded wagon. He looked at the ox lying in the mud. He looked at the 3 children watching from a careful distance. Then he said, "Your situation seemed to call for mules." Martha wrote about this moment. "His face was not kind exactly," she wrote, "but it was honest. I had seen enough unkind men who looked kind to know the difference had value." The rest of August 19th was work. Elias assessed the wagon and told her what could be moved and what could not. He unhitched her surviving ox and added the animal to his mule line. He did not ask permission before he began unloading the wagon. Not from disrespect, but because the light was already going and there was no time for the kind of conversation that requires permission. Martha understood this and helped him without being asked. They worked in near silence except for the necessary exchange of information: weight of the trunk, condition of the flour barrels, which pieces of furniture were worth the trouble and which were not. She told him to leave the secretary desk. He looked at it, a beautiful piece, walnut, clearly carried from Ohio with real care, and he said it would fit on the second mule. She said, "Leave it." He left it. Later, when she had time to think about that exchange, she decided it was the moment she knew she could trust him. A man who argues about a desk you have already decided to leave is a man who doesn't understand that some things have already been grieved. They made camp on the south bank that night. Elias said it was too late to attempt a crossing, and Martha agreed. But what she wrote in her diary that evening had less to do with crossing times and more to do with Thomas, who had been unusually quiet all day, and who now, in the firelight, she could see was flushed along his neck and ears in a way that made her stomach go cold. She knew what fever meant on the Oregon Trail. She had watched it take her husband. She had watched it take the Henderson boy 2 days before Fort Hall. She pressed the back of her hand to Thomas's forehead and felt the heat rising off him in waves, and she said nothing, because James and Lucy were listening, and there are things you keep only in your mind until you know whether they are true. Elias noticed. He was on the other side of the fire, tending the mules, and he glanced over and saw her face and said, "How old is the baby?" 14 months, she said. He nodded once. He went to his pack and came back with a small cloth bag. "Dried willow bark," he said. "Someone I knew used it for fevers. You make it into a tea." He stopped on the word someone and did not finish the sentence, and Martha did not ask him to. She took the willow bark without a word. She spent most of that night awake, keeping the fire low and the tea steady and her hand on Thomas's chest, feeling it rise and fall. James woke twice and she told him everything was fine, and he was old enough to know she might be lying and young enough to need to believe her. Lucy slept through all of it. The prairie around them was enormous and dark and utterly indifferent, and the Snake River made its ceaseless sound behind them, and Martha sat with her baby and waited for morning. Thomas's fever broke near dawn. She allowed herself one long, slow breath, the kind that takes everything you have been holding and releases it into the air, and then she added wood to the fire and started water for breakfast. When Elias woke, he looked at the baby first and then at her. She said, "He's better." He said, "Good." And then he began saddling the mules because it was time to cross the river. The Snake at 3 Island Crossing was fast and cold even in August, fed by snowmelt from the mountains to the north, and the channel between the second island and the north bank was the most treacherous for wheels. Elias spent 20 minutes walking the bank and reading the water before he came back and said, "Now." They put the children on the mules. Martha carried Thomas herself, strapped to her chest, her hands free for the reins of the lead animal. The water came up to the mule's belly in the first channel and higher in the second, and there was one moment, between the second island and the north bank, when the current hit the wagon sideways and everything hung on whether the team would hold their line or turn. Martha felt it happen through the reins, the animals leaning into the water, finding their footing, the wagon straightening. She wrote about that moment. "I did not pray," she wrote. "I have heard people say they prayed in moments like that and I believe them. But what I did was something more like negotiating. I held the reins and I held Thomas and I said to the river, 'Not yet. You have had enough from me. Not yet.' The river let them through. They came up on the north bank in the late morning, and Martha stood beside the wagon and let herself feel it. The right bank, finally, the right side of the Snake River, 40 miles to Fort Boise. Elias unsaddled the lead mule and said, without looking at her, "We're 2 days behind the company." She said, "I know." He said, "I don't think we should try to catch them." She looked at him. He was looking at the mules. He said, "They have 40 wagons and 300 people, and they move at the pace of the slowest wheel. If we push, we reach Fort Boise before them. If we wait, we lose time we don't have before the mountains." Martha understood what he was saying. She also understood what he was not saying, that traveling alone, just the two of them and the children, was the kind of arrangement that required a frank conversation about exactly who they were to each other. She said, "Mr. Horn, are you a man I can trust?" He looked at her then. He said, "I have not always been, but I am trying to be." It was an answer she had not expected. She considered it for a long time before she said, "That's honest." He said, "I find it's easier to be honest when there's no one watching." She almost smiled. She said, "Then we go to Fort Boise." They traveled the 40 miles in 2 days, which was faster than most wagon trains managed. Without 100 other wagons churning the trail ahead of them, the pace was clean and steady. Elias drove the team in the mornings. Martha drove in the afternoons. James rode the quietest mule, which he named Captain, and Lucy walked beside Martha when she was awake and rode in the wagon when she wasn't. And Thomas nursed and slept and gradually returned to his ordinary self, which was to say loud and opinionated about the world. They talked, not constantly, and not about everything, but in the hours on the wagon bench, with the sage going past and the mountains beginning to show on the western horizon, they talked in the way that people talk when they have been through something difficult together and are no longer strangers but do not yet know what they are. She told him about Ohio, about the farm that had been her father's and then her brother's after the will was read, as though she had not spent 10 years working it alongside them, about her husband, whom she had loved genuinely and mourned genuinely, and about whom she still could not speak without a specific pressure in her chest that she had not yet decided how to name, about Oregon, the 160 acres promised under the Donation Land Claim Act, that were now hers alone if she arrived and filed, that she intended to file for even if she had to walk into the land office in Oregon City with a baby on her hip and mud on her boots. Elias listened to all of it. He told her, in return, less than she had told him. He told her he had been to California and come back. He told her he could build most things that needed building. He told her that he had been married once and she had died, and that he did not talk about it but wanted her to know, so she would understand why he traveled alone. She said, "I'm sorry." He said, "It was 7 years ago. I have had time to carry it." She said, "Does it get lighter?" He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "It gets familiar." They reached Fort Boise on August 23rd. Martha bought dried beef and salt and a new pair of shoes for James, whose left boot had split at the toe somewhere in Idaho. She wrote 2 letters and posted them with the fort's eastbound courier, one to her sister in Ohio, one to her husband's mother, who had not believed Martha would make it this far, and whom Martha had made a private project of proving wrong. Elias bought feed for the mules and said nothing about the letters, but she noticed him watching the courier ride out with an expression she could not quite read. They left Fort Boise on August 24th. What came next were the Blue Mountains. If the Snake River had been the trail's most dangerous crossing, the Blue Mountains of eastern Oregon were its most grinding obstacle. 30 miles of switchbacks and old-growth timber and trails so steep that wagons had to be lowered by rope on the eastern face and hauled by hand on the western. The elevation climbed toward 5,000 feet. The timber closed in around them. The enormous sky that had been with Martha since Missouri disappeared into a canopy of Douglas fir and ponderosa pine, and the temperature dropped 20 degrees from the desert below. James thought the mountains were magnificent. He said so repeatedly, which was the first sustained enthusiasm she had seen from him since before his father's death, and Martha let herself be glad of it even as she watched the trail and counted the daylight and thought about early snow. On the second day in the mountains, the rear left wheel of Martha's wagon cracked on a root. It did not break through, not yet. But Elias heard the sound and stopped his mules and got down and looked and said, "We have maybe 10 miles on it." Martha got down and looked too. She said, "Can it be repaired?" He said, "With the right wood and half a day." She said, "Find the wood." He found a length of ash from a fallen tree across the trail, straight-grained and the right thickness, and they spent 4 hours on the side of a mountain in eastern Oregon repairing a wheel while the children ate dried beef and James helpfully described everything Elias was doing to Lucy, who was not listening. Martha held the wheel steady while Elias worked the new spoke into place and set the iron rim back with fire from a small blaze they built beside the trail. The smoke went straight up in the still forest air, and she watched it rise through the fir branches and thought about Ohio and thought about Oregon and thought about the man kneeling in the dirt in front of her, doing careful work without being asked. She had not expected this. She had not expected any of this. When the work was done, Elias stood and tested the wheel and said, "That'll hold." She said, "Thank you." He said, "You held it steady for 4 hours." She said, "Well." He said, "Most people would have let go." She looked at him. She said, "I've noticed you have a habit of paying attention when people don't let go." Something passed across his face, not quite a smile, but the cousin of one. He said, "I've had occasion to pay attention." They came through the Blue Mountains on August 28th. What lay before them was the Willamette Valley, beginning to show in the distance, green in a way that nothing had been green since Missouri. Martha stopped the wagon at the top of the last descent and looked west. She had come 2,100 miles. She had buried her husband. She had lost an ox and a secretary desk and more sleep than she would ever count. She had sat through a night with a sick baby on the wrong side of the Snake River while the prairie made its enormous indifferent sound around her. She had gotten here. Thomas was pulling at her sleeve. She lifted him into her lap without looking down. She kept her eyes on the valley. Elias had stopped his mules beside her. He said nothing. He looked at the same view and was quiet, and after a while she understood that his quiet was not the absence of something but the presence of it, that this was how he stood before something too large for ordinary words. She said, "Did you think you'd be here again?" He said, "I didn't plan that far." She said, "What did you plan?" He was quiet for longer this time. Then he said, "I planned to turn around at the Snake River. And then I didn't." Martha looked at him. He was looking at the valley. She said, quietly, "I know." He said, "I'm glad I didn't." She said, "So am I." They came into Oregon City on September 8, 1853. Martha filed for her land claim the following morning with Thomas on her hip and mud on her boots, which was exactly as she had imagined it, except that Elias was standing 2 steps behind her, and she found she did not mind. The land officer asked her if she was filing as a single woman. She looked at the form in front of her. She looked at Elias. He was looking at the wall. She said, "Yes." She filed as a single woman. She took her claim number. She stepped outside into the Oregon City September morning, which smelled of river water and fir trees and wood smoke from the mills, and Elias was beside her, and they stood for a moment in the ordinary remarkable fact of having arrived. She said, "I need to find the land." He said, "I know where the claim district starts. I can take you." She said, "Elias." He looked at her. She said, "When we find it, will you stay?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Is that what you want?" She said, "I am asking what you want." He said, "Martha, I turned around at the Snake River." She said, "I know." He said, "That was the want." Martha Caldwell filed her land claim in the Willamette Valley in September 1853. 160 acres in the hills south of Oregon City, where the Douglas firs gave way to open land, and the view to the west was long and clear. She built a house there. It was small at first and larger later, with a porch that faced west, which Elias built in the second winter because she had mentioned once, only once, that she liked to watch the weather come in. She kept her diary until 1871, by which time her handwriting had grown cramped with age, but her sentences had not. James became a farmer, and then a county judge. Lucy taught school. Thomas grew up tall and quiet, with a particular habit of turning back to check on people who were falling behind, which his mother recognized and never commented on, and which made her, privately, the most satisfied kind of glad. The last entry in Martha Caldwell's diary was dated October 14, 1871. Elias this morning told me he did not plan to find this life when he turned back at the river. I told him I did not plan to need him. He said, well, it seems we both managed anyway. I suppose that's true. I suppose that has always been how it works. Not by plan, but by turning back when you might have gone forward, and going forward when you might have stopped, and knowing, sometimes by grace and sometimes by hard experience, which is which. It rained this evening. The view to the west was the color of pewter and quite beautiful. I am, by most measures, a fortunate woman.